A few years ago, a friend and I were getting pretty sick of the New England weather. We get our fair share of sunshine up here, but only for about 3 weeks out of 52. After one particularly washout summer where the sky barely shifted from its regular gray tone, we decided on a road trip to alleviate the rain-soaked misery. We didn't have a destination in mind, just a direction south, as far south as we could go without having to buy a Spanish phrase book. About a fortnight in, we'd made it all the way down to New Mexico. I enjoyed the barbecue in South Carolina and relished the peach cobbler in Georgia, but nothing compared to the food in New Mexico. I thought I'd been eating good Mexican food back home, but I realized I had been eating lies. It turns out the closer you get to the border, the better the food gets. Mexican food isn't all about spice, although that is a big part of it. There's tangy, fruity salsa made from pineapples and the smoky flavor that ancho chili imparts to dishes. We were so charmed by New Mexico that instead of rolling through it into Arizona like we planned, we decided to tour a little more of the state before leaving. This meant rolling down dusty roads, visiting little cowboy towns, and taquito joints along the way. At one point, still a few hundred miles away from our planned stop, we were getting pretty tired. Driving at night can be disorienting and dangerous, so we decided to pull over and sleep a few hours until dawn before getting back on the road. The only problem was finding somewhere safe to park. When I pictured New Mexico, I imagined adobe brown desert scenes made famous by old westerns, but as it turns out, New Mexico has its fair share of snow-capped mountains and lush green forests. We happened to be driving by one such patch of tall pines when we called our rest stop. We pulled in, turned down a dirt road, and wound among the trees, taking it slow, trying to find a turnoff for a campground to park up and get some shut-eye. It took a while, but we found one, parked up, and turned off the engine before unpacking our sleeping gear and leaning back the seats. As you can imagine, New Mexico gets real warm and stays real warm well into the night. So although it leaves us prey to mosquitoes, cracking the window to allow some much-needed fresh air in was essential. It was actually kind of nice for a while, lying there, drifting off with the sound of crickets chirping and coyotes yipping in the hills. It was relaxing listening to the sounds of nature until I heard a sound that was distinctly unrelaxed, the sound of hushed human voices. My eyes opened in darkness as I strained to hear just what these voices were saying. I couldn't make out anything specific, just that at least 2 people were talking amongst themselves in hushed tones. This was a big red flag for me. Sometimes you get people walking past your car when you're trying to sleep, mostly in cities, but sometimes out in the sticks too. If they're loud, it generally means they're just drunk and heading home. Sure, drunk can be another kind of red flag for danger, but not nearly as much as actual hushed voices. Whispers mean a person doesn't want to be heard. Whispers mean someone is up to no good. Although we're from a state where legislation has made firearm ownership pretty much next to impossible, we weren't about to roll down to the deep south without proper protection. Not so much from the people. All our interactions with people in the southern states were overwhelmingly positive, but there's no reasoning with a bear or a rattlesnake. So we stopped at the first gun show we found in West Virginia to pick up something small but powerful, a .44 snub-nose revolver. The moment I heard those hushed whispering voices, I popped the glove compartment and took it out. After making sure it was loaded, I leaned over to my buddy and gently shook him awake. "Huh? What? What time is it?" His eyes were bloodshot, his voice croaky. "Listen to me," I said. The fear in my voice had him paying attention. "There's someone outside." We talked it over countless times, what we'd do if someone tried to rob or kidnap us. What was at first a morbid mental exercise had suddenly become all too real. We decided to get out and confront whoever was out there, hoping they'd hear that we were armed and scared and take off. It could have just been a few kids hanging around drinking, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. So we got out, me with the flashlight in one hand, the revolver in the other. We were both shining flashlights into the trees, but seeing nothing. We hadn't heard any voices since we got out of the car, and I was hoping they just moved on. But like I said, better safe than sorry. "Hey, anyone there?" my buddy called out into the darkness. We gave it a minute or so, and no one replied, but that didn't mean we felt safe and sound. So we started walking into the trees, trying to find whoever was whispering. I expected to find a handful of thugs who were going to rob us of our car and wallets, but what we found was much, much worse. The thing that hit me first was the smell. The further we got into the trees, the stronger the sickly sweet smell of hot garbage seemed to be. Neither of us had ever smelled anything like it in our lives, so it wasn't like we had anything to compare it to. It wasn't like we recognized it or anything. Then we saw the pit. The shadow of the ground opened up before us, and we saw the shovels, the plastic sheets stained with something brownish red. Flies were buzzing around the open pit so loud I could barely hear my own voice when I exclaimed in pure horror. And what lay at the bottom? It was a body, a human body, only it was barely recognizable as one. It had been beaten so badly it looked like a monster, a hideous imitation of the human form. The face was swollen, bloodied, and bruised, eyelids swollen shut, huge busted lips still leaked gore onto the neck and chin. We ran, got into our car, and got out of there. What followed was probably the most terrifying few minutes of my life. I expected to see another vehicle's lights appear on the road behind us, getting bigger as they got closer, chasing us down to silence us forever. But they didn't. Nothing happened. The adrenaline had us so wired that we drove all night to the next town, calling in at a local sheriff's department as soon as we arrived. We didn't stay long in that area, so naturally we didn't hear back from the cops regarding what happened to the body or if they found the guys trying to bury it. But I still think about it every now and then and what that poor person could have possibly done to deserve to die in such a way. My friends and I are grunge freaks. We started out on Nirvana and Soundgarden, eventually discovering more obscure bands like Mudhoney, the Melvins, and Screaming Trees. Anyone who knows anything about grunge will tell you that it all started in Seattle, how this spontaneous new genre sprang out of the ashes of post-punk to take the world by storm, and it all happened within a few square miles. So naturally, Seattle is like a mecca for grunge fans, and after years of planning and false commitments, we finally got our stuff together and went on a road trip to our sacred city. That's how we ended up on the Wyoming interstate. We were just driving along, singing along to Alice in Chains songs when the next thing I know, I can see red and blue flashes in my rearview mirror. My buddies in the back seat spin around, seeing the same thing I did, an unmarked vehicle with one of those attachable emergency lights on the top. As I start to pull over, I'm wondering where this cop car came from. We were on this long stretch of open road and could see for miles around us. It was pretty unnerving that it had managed to just creep up on us like that. But you know how it is, traffic cops tend to stay out of sight in little rest areas or whatever, their speedometers at the ready. I was well within the speed limit, but I was still worried. I'd be lying if I said we didn't have anything on us that we shouldn't have, but that was all buried in our bags in the trunk, and even then, it wasn't exactly enough to charge us with. So I just got my driver's license ready on my lap and kept my hands at 10 and 2 like a good little citizen. The cop turned off his lights and then got out of the unmarked car, walking along the dusty road towards us. He was wearing civilian clothes, a baseball cap, aviator sunglasses, and a checkered shirt, but I could clearly see the utility belt and badge he was wearing. When he knocked on my window, I promptly rolled it down, smiling. "Good afternoon, officer. I'm no bootlicker, but I'm not going to give this guy an excuse to ruin our road trip. What follows probably isn't exactly what was said that day, but it's the best I can remember. Afternoon, officer. How can I help you?" "Driver's license and registration," he demanded curtly. Sure thing. I took one hand off the steering wheel and handed him my license. He took a long, careful look first at my license, then at me. "Detroit," he finally said dismissively. "You're a long way from home, son. What's your business in Wyoming?" "We're heading to Seattle," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "just passing through." The cop seemed to mull this over for a moment, then handed back my license without another word. I started to feel a little relieved until he spoke again. "Mind if I take a look in your trunk?" My heart sank. I glanced at my friends, who were all equally wide-eyed and anxious. Saying no wasn't really an option, not without raising suspicion, so I nodded and popped the trunk. The officer walked to the back of the car, and we could hear him rummaging through our stuff. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find anything. After what felt like an eternity, he returned to my window, a small smile on his face. "Looks like you're clean. Sorry for the trouble, just doing my job." I nodded, forcing a smile. "No problem, officer. Have a good day." He tipped his hat and walked back to his car. We watched as he drove off, disappearing into the distance. As soon as he was out of sight, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. "That was close," one of my friends muttered. "Too close," I agreed. We sat there for a few minutes, letting the adrenaline fade before starting the car and continuing on our way. The rest of the trip was thankfully uneventful. We made it to Seattle and spent a few days visiting all the iconic grunge spots, Sub Pop Records, the Central Saloon, and of course, Kurt Cobain's old house. It was everything we'd hoped for and more. But that close call in Wyoming stayed with us, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. Growing up in the Midwest, I was no stranger to tornadoes. They were just a part of life, like thunderstorms or blizzards, but nothing could have prepared me for the tornado that hit our town when I was 10. It was a hot, muggy day in late June. The kind of day where the air feels thick and heavy, like you could cut it with a knife. My friends and I were playing in the park when we heard the tornado siren go off. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. We knew what the siren meant, but we'd never actually heard it go off for real before. "Let's go," I shouted, grabbing my bike. We pedaled home as fast as we could, the sky turning an ominous shade of green as we rode. By the time I got home, my mom was already ushering my younger siblings into the basement. "Get inside," now she yelled when she saw me. I ditched my bike and ran inside, heading straight for the basement. We huddled together, listening to the wind howl and the house creak. It felt like the world was ending. The tornado hit our town directly, tearing through houses and uprooting trees. It felt like forever, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. When it was over, we emerged from the basement to find our neighborhood in ruins. Our house was mostly intact, but many of our neighbors weren't so lucky. Cars were overturned, roofs were ripped off, and debris was scattered everywhere. In the days that followed, the community came together to help each other rebuild. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, bringing food, water, and supplies. It was a long, hard process, but we made it through. The experience taught me a lot about resilience and the strength of community. Even now, years later, I still think about that day every time I hear a storm siren. My friends and I decided to see the country. We had grown up around the Sacramento area, and as much as we loved our native California, we knew the lower West Coast hardly represented the United States. There is a huge stretch of land between the coasts called America, or so some would have you believe. I didn't want to go off to college and into full-time work without having a story or two to tell my dorm mates. Cut to about 3 days into the journey, we're on our way to our first real stop in Boise, Idaho. My buddy hooked his iPhone up to the minivan speakers via an auxiliary cable and played every single road trip-related song he could find. I might have been annoyed if his music taste wasn't so good. Keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel, we all roared along with Jim Morrison, Roadhouse Blues blasting so loud I could barely hear the van's engine. It was so much fun. We dreamed up the ultimate road trip, and now we're actually living it. I didn't even need a beer to feel the buzz of it. Just a few miles outside of Boise, saw someone standing by the side of the road in the distance. It's important to remember the frame of mind we were in, romanticizing the road. We were all Jack Kerouac that day. I mean, I'd never normally stop for a hitchhiker. I'd watched way too many horror films. But since there were 4 of us packed into that van, a kind of collective bravado had taken over us. As we passed the dude and saw he actually had his thumb out, we collectively flipped. I stopped the van in the middle of the road and slowly started reversing up towards where this guy stood. In a ride, dude, he instantly looked elated. He'd obviously had no luck for a few good hours, and a van full of teenagers was like a godsend to him. I could kind of see why people might pass him. He looked a little rough, with this weird kind of young old vibe going on. Like his clothes were fairly modern, but his skin was leathery as all get out, like he'd spent all day underneath the Utah or Nevada sun. "Hey, why all going to Boise?" asked in a gravelly voice. "Sure are, dude. Hop in." So the guy told us his name was Jimmy and that he was from Idaho originally but had spent a lot of time out of state for work. We asked him what he did for a living, and he gave us some weird answer about being a contractor. He said his last job was really constrictive, and he was happy to get away from it and was just heading back into Boise, some old friends. He started telling us stories from time to time on the road, and it sounded like he was something of a wild child in the early 80s. He went to California looking for work and ended up getting in a few scrapes with the law. At one point, one of my buddies asked Jimmy if he'd spent any time inside. I really don't know what he expected the answer to be, but all of a sudden, Jimmy's tone changed completely as he shot my friend a daggered look. "No, and I don't ever intend to," he replied contemptuously. The atmosphere in the van shifted. It was super awkward for a few miles, but the conversation soon returned to normal, with us swapping stories and sharing laughs. After about an hour or so of continuous driving, we were getting closer and closer to Boise's. But it was around then that we hit our first serious speed bump. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw an Idaho State Police cruiser speeding up behind us. I moved over a little to let it pass, only it didn't. Then Jimmy saw the cop car and ducked down in the seat. We started laughing and joking about him being a fugitive or something, but he didn't join in. He just stayed down in the seat and didn't make a sound. As soon as the cop car's lights turned on and the siren blared across the highway, I knew what was about to happen. It was like I could see the whole thing pan out in my head in slow motion, and I was powerless to do anything to stop it. It was far too late for that. I actually started slowing down to pull over, purely wishful thinking on my part. I expected to hear Jimmy say something, and I was right. only it wasn't him that spoke first. "What? You have a gun?" one of my buddies cried. "You keep this thing moving. Don't stop for nothing." I heard him cock the hammer on his weapon. I didn't even turn around to see what it was. "You slow this van down, and I must shoot every single one of you you hear." I've never been so scared in my entire life. I could hear the cop shouting over his loudspeaker, "Driver, pull the vehicle over to the side of the road right now," but I couldn't. We were trapped. It was only about then that I checked the fuel gauge out of habit. It turned out to be a godsend. In our foolish revelry, we had passed numerous gas stations we really should have stopped at to refuel. Now we only had a few miles worth of gas. All we'd have to do was wait for it to run out. I remember feigning a kind of solidarity with the guy, assuring him I wouldn't pull over until we'd passed the state lines on the other side of Boise. My buddies must have thought I was nuts, but they didn't know what I did. They didn't know that all we had to do was run the clock out. "Oh, we're running out of gas." "I'm sorry, dude. I'm gonna have to pull over." "Your best chance is to just jump out and run. Just run and never look back." Jimmy ate it up. It was an Oscar-winning performance, if I do say so myself. He actually patted me on the shoulder as I slowed the van down and edged over to the roadside. "You're a good kid. You'll do all right," he said. I remember his breath smelling rotten. When I finally pulled the car over, one of my buddies slid the van door open, and Jimmy hauled it into the trees. One of the cops jumped out, securing us in the van, while his partner got this big dog from the back seat of their cruiser and chased the guy through the woods. We were there for an hour or two while the cops searched our van, but we didn't have anything illegal on us, thank God. We had finished all the beer we'd managed to wrangle the night before, or we might have actually had something to worry about. Once it was established that the guy was basically holding us hostage, they let us go. One of the cops actually told me I did the right thing. They didn't catch him, and as far as I know, they never have. Whatever the case, I know Jimmy can't have been the dude's real name. No one was hurt, nothing was damaged, but still I have zero intention of ever picking up a hitchhiker again. What follows is the story of the most terrible night of my entire life so far. I haven't told anyone this story online before, and only a handful of my friends and family even know this actually happened. I will try to tell it as best as I can, but if I'm honest, my hands are trembling as I try to recall the events of that night. We live in Delhi, India, and it was our first ever road trip, which we planned to drive down to Kolkata. We booked a rental vehicle from a company called Zoomcar, which came with a few problems as the staff on duty didn't seem to know anything about the booking. But eventually, after some complaining, we managed to convince them to rush through some paperwork with a bribe, and they got us the rental license. Anyhow, we managed to actually get our vehicle without much time wasted, and we were very excited to finally be on the way to Kolkata. About 60 kilometers away from Howrah, which is a suburb of Kolkata, at about 9 that evening, we acquired the necessary things, which were obviously cigarettes and beers that we purchased from a local bottle shop. We would drink them on the way to save some time. We stopped briefly to have our dinners at a roadside restaurant, then carried onward towards Kolkata. A few hours later, closer to midnight, we were rolling along this big Indian highway, listening to that Avicii song, "I Took a Pill in Ibiza." We were in the car, smoking cigs, and listening to the songs. Our playlist was fantastic because everyone was a music lover. There were 8 of us in total, so it was quite the ruckus inside the van. I was sitting in the middle seats at the window behind the driver's seat. I lit a cigarette, and I was feeling incredibly relaxed. I had cracked the window and the cool breeze was touching my face. I was playing songs and was just scrolling Instagram feeds. Everyone was enjoying it. It had been raining slowly from the evening, but around 1:30 a.m., our driver lost control. The car smashed through the metal fence at the side of the road and fell into a deep pond. For some minutes I was rendered unconscious, but the water level soon stabilized, and we looked for the first chance to get to safety. The one who was sitting in the front next to the driver's seat broke the windshield as it was already cracked. We got out, and we were drenched in water. I took my phone, as it was my phone playing the song Rich Love by Honor Republic. Everybody else's phone was nowhere to be found. Nobody was hurt, except 3 of us, including me. I was bleeding in the rain, and my light t-shirt was drenched with blood. I was bleeding from my ears and fingers of my right hand. I couldn't stop the bleeding. Simultaneously, the one who was driving got hurt in the legs from the accelerator, and the one who was sitting next to him got hurt in the ears and nose. I got myself out of that pond, taking the support of my friends and the wrecked car. My friends managed to recover 2 phones, one of which was useless, and the other survived because it was an iPhone 7, which acted as a savior to call emergency services. When we left for the hospital, I was feeling cold from blood loss, and the EMT provided me a towel soaked in water to stop the blood, which was pouring out from my ear. We called other friends to wait for us in the hospital. When Baiwani arrived, I got 7 stitches in my ears, and my friend who was sitting in the front seat got 5 stitches. The other one who was driving didn't take the treatment. We reported the accident to the Zoom car staff. We got the case settled in the police station by paying them, of course. We were all released from the hospital around 5 in the morning, relieved and thankful to God for our safe return to our homes. The thoughts of that night are terrifying, and it haunts me sometimes. I didn't get into a car for months, and rain scared me for many days when I saw it on the road. I thanked God for giving me another chance to live this wonderful life and to be a part of this enormous world. I am willing to live this life in a more different way and take the chances that I didn't take before. The nightmares of the accident still haunt me. After this accident, I went on many trips, and we stopped one time at the spot of the accident and exhaled the trauma out together. It was just for the fear which was deep inside whenever I sat in a car or whenever a rainstorm arrived. It was basically all about feeling good and getting rid of the fear and terrible thoughts of that night. We drive safely now and nothing has happened since, not a scratch. After that night, I would like to share one more thing, which is a little bit shocking. On one of the many trips, we got the same red color van which was with us that night at 2 a.m., drenched with water and blood. Nobody noticed except for one friend who told us the next day and showed the car number plates. We were surprised, and there was silence with a smile on everybody's face. Experiences come from bad experiences. Never stop living and grow through what you go through. Lyle Thomas McCann was born near Red Deer, Alberta on August 24, 1931, as part of a large family of Scottish descent. He met his wife Marie in Torrington in the early 1950s, and the couple married just a few years later, eventually moving to St. Albert in 1964, where they lived ever since. Lyle was employed for most of his life as a long-haul truck driver, making journeys all over Canada and the United States to support Marie and their 3 children. On July 3, 2010, Lyle and Marie McCann left their St. Albert home for a vacation. They had been planning a road trip to be exact. The plan was to pick up one of their daughters on the 10th of that month when she landed at the Abbotsford International Airport. On the day of their departure, they were spotted by witnesses at a Superstore gas station, filling up the tank of their 1999 Gulfstream motorhome with a green Hyundai Tucson attached via a trailer. It is believed that the couple drove down the Yellowhead Highway on their way to the airport. However, on the evening of July 5th, Canadian firefighters received a call from a member of the public informing them that a motorhome was on fire at the Minnow Lake campground just outside of town in Edson, Alberta. Emergency services rushed to the scene, putting out the fire and searching frantically for any injured victims. No bodies were found, but investigators made a chilling discovery: the motorhome had belonged to Lyle and Marie McCann. Strangely, in addition to no bodies being found inside the home, the couple's green Hyundai was missing. Initially, hopes of finding the couple were high, but once the Royal Canadian Mounted Police visited the McCann's home and found no one present, hopes began to dwindle. The McCanns had planned to pick up their daughter Trudy from Abbotsford International on July 10th, but when the McCanns failed to arrive at the planned date and time, their daughter Trudy Holder began to worry. It wasn't like her parents to be late, and if they were, it went without saying that they would have notified her in advance. She tried to contact them but received no response. By this time, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. On July 10th, the same day Trudy had expected to meet her parents, she reported them missing. A massive search effort was launched, involving police, search and rescue teams, and volunteers. Despite the extensive search, no trace of the McCanns or their vehicle was found. As days turned into weeks, the hope of finding the McCanns alive began to fade. The missing couple's case attracted widespread media attention and speculation. On July 16, 2010, the couple's missing Hyundai was found deep in the woods near the Minnow Lake campground, where their motorhome had been discovered. The vehicle was hidden under thick brush, adding to the suspicion that foul play was involved. The case took a darker turn when Travis Vader, a local man with a criminal record, became a person of interest. Vader had a history of drug offenses, theft, and violent behavior. He was arrested on unrelated charges, and during the investigation, police found evidence linking him to the McCann's disappearance. In July 2011, a year after the couple vanished, Vader was charged with their murders, even though their bodies had not been found. The trial was complex and controversial, with many questioning the evidence against Vader. Despite this, in September 2016, Vader was found guilty of second-degree murder. However, this conviction was later reduced to manslaughter. Vader was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. The case remains one of Canada's most haunting mysteries, as the bodies of Lyle and Marie McCann have never been found, leaving their family and the public without closure. These days, more and more young people are going traveling. Whether it be gap years from higher education or simply a break from the 9-to-5 grind, people are packing up their belongings into lightweight backpacks and setting off to tour Southeast Asia, namely Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Many of these travelers end up in Australia, given that it's much easier to find employment in an English-speaking country. One of these young people was named Peter Falconio. Peter Falconio hailed from West Yorkshire in the United Kingdom, but attended Brighton University with his girlfriend, Joanne Lees. After graduation, instead of settling down and getting full-time employment, the couple decided to travel the world. So on the 15th of November in the year 2000, the couple embarked on a trip to Nepal, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, and Australia. By the 16th of January 2001, the couple had arrived in Sydney on a working holiday visa. They worked hard for 5 long months, saving their earnings while they planned a comprehensive tour of the Australian coast. On the 25th of June, they departed on the road trip that would supposedly see them visiting Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Brisbane. On the night of Saturday, the 14th of July 2001, Falconio and Lyle were driving their camper van along the Stewart Highway in northern Australia, bound for the Devil's Marbles, a wildlife conservation area. Falconio was driving with his girlfriend Joanna sat next to him in the passenger seat. The two had been aware that a car had been following them since they stopped at a roadhouse in Barrow Creek and were expecting to be overtaken. However, when the white Toyota four-wheel drive drew alongside, the driver made frenzied gestures for them to pull over immediately. Concerned, Falconio stopped the van and went to speak with the man who had pulled off the road ahead of them. The stranger explained that he had seen sparks shooting out of the van's exhaust and was worried they might be seconds away from some kind of vehicle disaster. The pair of men went to the rear of the orange camper to investigate, but Joanna Lees remained suspicious of the strange man and moved over to the driver's seat should the couple need to leave in a hurry. That's when she heard a loud bang coming from the rear of the van. She turned but only saw the strange man standing at the driver's window, a large revolver in his hand. Terrified and not knowing what else to do, Joanne Lees unlocked the doors and allowed the strange man inside their car, where he promptly tied her hands behind her back with the black cable ties that he produced from his pocket. It was horribly obvious that the man had been planning this the entire time. Lees was paralyzed with fear for a few minutes, but when the man tried to bind her feet and gag her to keep her quiet, she knew there was no turning back from that. She kicked and screamed, wailed and cried until the man finally gave up trying to restrain her completely and began dragging her back to his Toyota. Lees knew that if this man got her back to wherever he was planning on taking her, it would mean the end of her life. She would be beaten, tortured, and potentially violated. Adrenaline kicked in when Lees saw the man's dog barking at her savagely from the back seat of his vehicle. When the man went to retrieve her boyfriend's lifeless body, she ran into the bush in an attempt to escape. The man searched for her, passing nearby 3 times, but she hid before finally flagging down a passing vehicle at 12:35 a.m. Last winter, I was driving down the freeway at night between the suburbs of a large metropolitan area. There were plenty of cars around, but it was around midnight, and it had been snowing. I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder of the freeway with a guy standing next to it, clearly needing some assistance. I saw him as I was driving past, but since it was late at night and cold, I figured I might as well take the next exit, loop around, and see if the guy still needed help. I got there and found a middle-aged, working-class guy standing outside his pickup. He was wearing blue overalls, slender, slightly balding, and gave off a weird vibe that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He said he was having car troubles, was from about 2 hours out of town, and that his alternator was shot and his battery needed a boost. Having owned a car with a shot alternator, I knew that when the battery dies, you need to boost it for a little while to get things running again. I told him it was no problem, commiserated with him for a minute, and popped my hood. He said he was going to grab his cables. When he came back, I noticed he had some sort of concealed metal object in his hand. I saw it for just a brief moment. It wasn't a knife, but it was metal and a little shorter than the length of his hand, and he was clearly trying to conceal it from my view. This all happened so fast, and I was immediately on high alert. I saw him bringing the cables to me so that I could hook up my battery. I instantly took a step back to put some distance between us and told him he could hook up my battery, and I'd wait in the car, all while being in an instantaneous full fight or flight mode, ready to lock and attack if he lunged at me. He didn't lunge and started connecting the cables to my battery. As I sat in my car, I started to wonder if I was imagining things. Maybe it was just something bundled in with the cables that he had in his hand. Perhaps I misread the situation as dangerous. After a few minutes, he went to start his car, shouted that it wasn't working, and then walked back towards my car. While he waited in front of my car, he put his head back under the hood to fiddle with the cables. All the while I watched him intently to make sure he didn't come to the car window because I was still spooked. He shouted again that it wasn't working and asked me to come take a look. I opened my window a bit and casually told him not to worry and that it was probably going to take some time. Luckily, I could just barely see my battery in the dark through the gap under the propped hood of my car. I saw him fiddle with the cables and shout again that it wasn't working and for me to come out. Then I saw him slip the metal object I had seen earlier and touch it to my battery terminal. Sparks shot out from where he touched it. He started yelling and jumped back. I immediately jumped out of my car and told him that something came up and I needed to go now. I honestly don't remember much of what he was trying to say as I cut him off or what exactly I said. I just remember saying that I needed to get out of there without taking my eyes off him for even half a second. I don't remember even how the cables came off my battery. Did I pull them out? Were they already off? But I slammed the hood, jumped in my car, and drove off. I still have no idea what his plan was or what he was trying to do, but I know for a fact that what I saw him do was in no way what he was telling me he was going to do. As I left him there and drove off, I was practically pinching myself trying to make heads or tails of what had just happened. I can't stress enough that the guy just gave off the weirdest vibes, like the hills have eyes kind of weird vibes. Maybe he was planning on trying to short my battery so that I was stuck there. To this day, I wonder if I encountered some sort of mass murderer who had been planning on kidnapping someone at the side of the freeway as they stopped to help. Who knows? Either way, it was strange as hell. He really spooked me, and I got away from that dude as fast as humanly possible. I still wish I had gotten a license plate or something to give to the cops, but in that moment, the only thing going through my mind was to remove myself from that situation as fast as humanly possible. In high school, I went on a month-long service trip to a village in Tanzania. It was a school-run trip and fairly small. There were about 12 of us, including the teachers. During the last week, we went on a safari in the Serengeti. The trip was fantastic, but it was a different experience. We were staying in a campsite in the middle of the Serengeti in tents. Every night we heard animal calls that made it hard to sleep because they were so close. The first few nights I barely slept at all. One night I woke up around midnight and realized I really had to pee. It was pitch black, and I didn't want to wake up my tent mate to go with me to the bathroom, which was about 100 feet away. I figured I'd just go quickly. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. Outside, the moonlight barely lit up the area, and the air was cool. I started walking towards the bathroom. As I was walking, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. I froze and shined my flashlight towards the noise. I didn't see anything, but I heard more rustling. I was scared but figured it was probably just a small animal. I continued walking when I heard a low growl behind me. I turned around and saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at me. I couldn't see what it was, but it was big. My heart started racing, and I slowly backed away, not turning my back to it. The growl got louder, and I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly I heard a loud roar, and the eyes moved closer. I realized it was a lion. I didn't know what to do. I remembered hearing that you shouldn't run because it triggers their hunting instincts, but I was too scared to move. Then I heard voices coming from the campsite. The lion seemed to hesitate and then retreated back into the bushes. I quickly ran back to the campsite, my heart pounding. I woke up one of the teachers, and told them what happened. They calmed me down and told me it was lucky the lion didn't attack. We decided it would be safer for everyone to stay in pairs if they needed to go out at night. The rest of the trip was amazing, but that night still haunts me. I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of safety and awareness in unfamiliar environments. This happened almost 10 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was in my sophomore year of college, and it was around the time of midterms. My roommate and I were cramming for exams and decided to take a break around midnight. We lived off campus in a small apartment complex that was about a 15-minute walk from the university. We decided to walk to the 24-hour convenience store nearby to grab some snacks. The streets were pretty empty, and it was a chilly night. As we were walking, we noticed a man following us. He was about a block behind, but we could tell he was keeping pace with us. We both felt uneasy but tried to brush it off as paranoia. We got to the store, grabbed our snacks, and started heading back home. The man was still behind us, but now he was closer. My roommate suggested we take a different route back to see if he was actually following us. We turned down a side street, and sure enough, he followed. We started walking faster, trying to get back to the main road. The man matched our pace and then started jogging to catch up. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. We reached the main road and saw a couple of people walking on the opposite side. We decided to cross the street to join them, hoping the presence of others would deter him. As we crossed, the man suddenly stopped and turned around, walking back in the direction he came from. We were relieved but still shaken. We made it back to our apartment and locked the door, double-checking all the windows. Neither of us slept well that night. The next day, we reported the incident to campus security. They took our statement and said they would keep an eye out, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. We never saw the man again, but for the rest of the semester we were extra cautious when walking at night. Looking back, I'm grateful nothing happened, but it was a terrifying experience that taught me always to trust my instincts and stay aware of my surroundings. This happened around 7 years ago. At the time, I worked in a job that was about a 45-minute drive away on a good day. It was a drive along little country roads to get to this isolated country town, but the pay was good and the benefits worked for me. Each night on my way home, I would drive down the main street of the town to an intersection, turning right to head home. One night I drove down to this intersection and waited for the lights to turn when suddenly and unexpectedly, I heard a knock on my passenger window. I turned to see two men staring at me through the window of their car, both looking kind of scruffy. The driver appeared really angry. Wondering what was going on, I lowered my window. The driver didn't even let me talk. "Why did you cut me off back there?" he demanded. I was confused, not having seen another car when I pulled out. "I didn't," I replied. He looked even angrier at my denial. "Yes, you did, back on Turnpike Lane. We nearly crashed," he insisted. I didn't come down Turnpike Lane. I was in the parking area at the top of the street and turned down from another road, I explained. It must have been someone with a similar car, as my car has a very distinctive color, but I've seen a few like it around. "You're a liar." "I don't believe you," he said. At this point, he was getting redder and redder, and his friend chimed in. "Why are you so nervous if it ain't you?" he asked. "Because your friend looks really angry, and I have an anxiety disorder. Plus, you two men are accosting a young woman on her own," I replied. At this point, there was a beep from behind me. We were holding up traffic. I pulled off, ignoring a roar from him. However, as I was driving, I heard a prolonged beep from behind me and saw him following me in the mirror. He must have cut into my lane to follow me. I began to become really frightened as they followed me toward a main road, wondering what I should do. A set of traffic lights turned red ahead of me, and I slowed down, panicking. I quickly locked my doors just in case, but the next thing I knew, he was pounding on my car door in an attempt to open it. I don't remember any of this, but I found out later that he had some sort of hammer in his hands. He broke my car window, attempted to pull me out of the car by my hair, and hit me once when he couldn't get me out. I think he must have knocked me out because the next thing I knew, a couple was checking my pulse and trying to stem the bleeding from a cut on my forehead. Apparently, this couple saw him pulling out past me, nearly colliding with the traffic light. In the end, he was caught. He pleaded not guilty in court, and I had to take the stand. It was proven via CCTV footage that I wasn't the driver he nearly collided with. He is still in jail, all over road rage and a case of mistaken identity. This happened around 12 years ago. My husband's family has a mountain house across the state. Once we get off the turnpike, we take a single country road up over a mountain and down the other side to our house. It's about a half-hour ride on this winding mountain road. In the middle section, near the top of the mountain, it is the most winding part, and the word slow is written across the road in giant letters. We take this road maybe 6 to 10 times a year and back. I'd been up the house dozens of times at this point, and nothing odd happened during the trip up until this one time. My husband was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and there were no other people in the car. A Billy Joel song was playing on the iPod through the car speakers. I think it was Uptown Girl. There is no radio reception anywhere near this remote mountain. As we approached the area where slow is written across the road, a man's voice, not Billy Joel's, came through the car speakers and said in this deep, creepy voice, "Slow down." The words were not in that song. My husband and I looked at each other like, oh my God, did you hear that? We had no idea where it came from, since there were no houses or anything on this side of the mountain, and we didn't pass any other cars on the way down. We laughed about it and bring it up every once in a while when we go up the mountain and see the word slow on the pavement. It's never happened again in the hundreds of trips we've made since that night. One time, however, as we were going along, we started to notice dead deer on the sides of the road, quite a few of them. I remember saying something about hoping not to hit one. Then suddenly we were on a strip of road for a solid 5 to 10 minutes where both sides of the road were absolutely covered in piles of dead deer, one on top of the other, mangled together, eyes open and shining up in the headlights, clearly dead. They were piled and twisted up with backwards necks, some feet up in the air, and such. There was no blood or gore, just hundreds of intact dead deer bodies lining and piling on top of each other on both sides of the road. I remember just staring at them and looking over at the dead piles on the other side of the road on occasion, and one of us saying something about being in between walls of dead deer. It sounded totally messed up, but my brother remembers it too, feeling like we were in a daze or something. In hindsight, it should have really freaked us out, but I remember just staring at them and seeing their eyes shining. I remember thinking it looked like they were all looking back at me, wondering why there were so many, wondering why no one else was around, but really just not saying anything and mindlessly driving through it for several minutes. It wasn't until after we were past them that there were other vehicles and semis passing by us again that we sort of snapped out of it and said, that was really messed up. I had been taking pictures of everything that tripped random clouds, cows and fields. My feet on the dashboard, but I didn't think for a second to take a picture of this bizarre road lined with dead deer on both sides because I don't think I was thinking straight. My brother and I speak about this often. It bothers us now because we both remember how weird it was. But saying it to other people never seems to justify the absurdity. I don't think people believe it happened, but we both witnessed it and felt the same thing. I was 19, driving home from work late at night from a bar and grill. My drive home was about 14 miles in roughly half an hour. I noticed a blue car immediately after leaving. As it was late, maybe midnight to 1 a.m., there were only a few cars around. It was not a police car, and I did not recognize anyone in it. The driver was an average-looking man with a beard. This car followed me all the way home down the main roads. When I turned into my subdivision, they did too. Realizing this, I started driving in loops to avoid leading them to my house. They followed me down every side street, clearly going out of their way to follow me in the middle of the night. I went into fight or flight mode. If I got pulled over, I planned to explain to the officer what was happening and be happy to go to the station where it was safe. We were the only cars on the road. After a few turns, I thought I had lost them. I made sure to speed up on a few turns with my lights off so they couldn't see where I turned. Then, I sat for a minute with all my lights off and phone down in pitch black. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing. Then, after a minute, I saw them turn onto my road. I left my headlights off and drove lawlessly to escape them, ignoring stop signs and speed limits in an urban area. It was honestly insane. Luckily, I drove to a friend's house where a small party was going on, so I knew I was safe. I'll never know who it was, why they did it, or what would have happened if I had led them home. Thank God I'm a great driver and have watched enough spy movies to probably save my life that night. This summer, my 17-year-old daughter was working a late-night shift. It was a little after midnight when I left to pick her up. When I stepped outside, it was eerily silent. You couldn't hear the frogs or insects. Nothing. I stood there just waiting to hear them again, but I had this awful feeling something was watching me. I got in the car, shook off the weird feelings, and turned the radio up loud to distract myself. I started driving down the road with my brights on as there are many deer in the area. Making a right turn onto another road, my headlights caught a glimpse of something. It was black, quick, and jumped from the roadway onto the side of a steep hill on the opposite side. I was scared at this moment and afraid to drive past this area. For the remaining drive, I kept trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Was it a deer, some animal, maybe an alien? The possibilities were endless, but I had never seen anything like it. When we made it home, the nightlife noises were back and thriving. There was no eerie feeling that something was lurking nearby. A few weeks had passed, and I spoke with a neighbor that lives 10 minutes away. We live way out in the country, and she said some weird things had been happening around there. I thought maybe she meant a thief or coyotes were around. Then she said, "You might think I'm crazy, but," and goes on to tell me how silent it would get at night more often. There were some dark figures that they had seen, not just her, but also a few other people that lived nearby. I told her of my ordeal and explained exactly what I had seen because I'd never seen anything else like it. She asked me, did it look like a Dementor from Harry Potter? "Oh my God, yes," I replied. She then told me her sister-in-law was out visiting and left after it was dark to go home, driving close to the area where my house is located. My neighbor gets a call from her sister-in-law, screaming and crying hysterically. They drove to where she was, and she was too scared to even open the car door. They convinced her to finally get out of the car. She was shaking and could barely speak, but she managed to tell them that as she was driving past the same spot where I saw the figure, something emerged from the woods. It was tall, black, and seemed to glide across the road in front of her car, disappearing into the darkness. They brought her back to my neighbor's house, where she calmed down enough to explain what had happened. She described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and coldness, as if all warmth had been sucked out of the air. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched even after they brought her inside. After hearing her story, I realized we weren't alone in our experiences. There was something strange happening in our quiet rural community. We never did find out exactly what those dark figures were, but from then on we were always a little more cautious when driving or walking alone at night. It was a summer we would never forget, filled with mystery and a lingering sense of unease whenever the night fell silent.